History remembers castles as monuments to kings and conquerors, as symbols of crowns, banners, and men who rode to war. But power in the Middle Ages did not always sit on the throne, and it did not always ride at the head of an army. Sometimes power ruled from behind stone walls. Sometimes it ruled through inheritance, marriage, law, and survival. This is the story of Joan de Valence, a woman who controlled some of the most strategically important lands and castles in medieval Britain, at a time when England, Wales, and Scotland were being reshaped by conquest, rebellion, and royal ambition. Joan de Valence was born around 1248 into one of the most powerful and controversial families of the 13th century. Her father, William de Valence, was half-brother to King Henry III of England, a foreign-born noble, elevated rapidly through royal favour and deeply resented by much of the English baronage. Her mother, Joan de Montmorency, was heiress to the vast estates of William Marshal, Regent of England and the most celebrated knight of his age. Through her parents, Joan inherited something far more dangerous than wealth: frontier power. She was born into the Welsh Marches, a region where castles were instruments of domination, where law bent to force, and where authority had to be defended as much as it was inherited. This was not a passive legacy. It was contested, militarized, and perpetually unstable. Joan's marriage was not a romantic union. It was a high-stakes political alliance. She married John the Red Comyn of Badenoch. Through this marriage, Joan became embedded in the highest levels of Scottish politics, at the heart of a kingdom already moving towards civil war. The Commons were kingmakers. They controlled vast territories, commanded armed followings, and stood directly in the path of Bruce's ambitions. Joan was no distant observer to this struggle. She stood at its centre, as wife, political asset, and later as a dangerously exposed widow. While her marriage tied her to Scotland, Joan's power base remained English, most notably Goodrich Castle. Perched above the River Wye, Goodrich was one of the most formidable fortresses in the marshes. It controlled river traffic, trade routes, movement between England and Wales, and access into contested borderlands. Crucially, Joan held Goodrich in her own right through inheritance. This was not symbolic ownership. Joan appointed officials, managed revenues, defended her legal claims, and maintained authority over a militarized landscape. Goodrich answered to her, not to a husband acting on her behalf. In a region defined by rebellion and opportunism, that mattered. In 1306, Joan's life was violently reshaped. Her husband, John Comyn, was murdered by Robert the Bruce inside a church in Dumfries. An act that shocked Christendom and ignited the wars of Scottish independence. Joan fled Scotland. She returned to her family strongholds in England, including Goodrich, travelling with a large and well-documented household retinue, not ceremony but protection. Widowhood could destroy a medieval woman's position. For Joan de Valence, it did the opposite. As a widow, she gained full control of her dower lands, independent legal standing, and direct authority over her estates. She never remarried. Instead, she exercised what medieval law technically allowed, but rarely celebrated: female territorial lordship. Joan lived through extraordinary instability. She witnessed the Barron Wars, the rebellion against Henry III, the rise and fall of Simon de Montfort, and consolidation of royal power under Edward I. The de Valence family were widely hated, seen as foreign, aggressive, and dangerously powerful. Yet Joan survived every political realignment. Her lands were not confiscated, her castles were not slighted, her authority endured. That survival was not accidental. It was the result of legal competence, strategic neutrality, and unrelenting vigilance. Joan was a significant patron of Tintern Abbey, but medieval religious patronage was never only about faith. Supporting monasteries reinforced legitimacy, stabilised contested territory, and embedded noble authority into sacred landscapes. By tying her family's memory to Tintern, Joan anchored her power not only into stone castles, but in spiritual authority recognised across generations. Faith and power were not opposites, they were partners. Joan de Valence died in 1307, the same year as Edward I. She was buried at Tintern Abbey among the elite of the martial world she had dominated. Her tomb sadly does not survive intact, but her legacy does, in records, in ruins, and in what never happened. Her lands were not seized, her authority was not erased, and her memory was not written out of history. Joan de Valence is not remembered for scandal or spectacle. She is remembered, when remembered at all, for something rarer: competent, sustained female power. She controlled strategic castles, governed frontier lands, survived dynastic violence, and exercised authority without legend or myth. She reminds us that medieval women did not simply exist around power, some of them were power. And when we stand in the ruins of Greenwich Castle today, we are not only standing in the shadow of kings, we are standing in the domain of Joan de Valence. This has been a long look at Joan de Valence. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, comment and subscribe. It generally helps this channel grow. And join me next time as we take another long look. Until then, take care.